Hi, it's Anthony Magnabosco here, and you're watching Atheist Edge.
These are not the real results of any study, but just to illustrate what you can do with these tables once you build them. Some things you can notice are that the sample is problematically small, only 5 depressed atheists. Notice how just a single random hiccup putting just one more depressed atheist in so that it comes out 6 out of 123, which would equal 4.9%, has a large effect on the result. And the accidental inclusion or exclusion of a single person by a randomizing process is really easy. So an N this low is a red flag for results one needs to be cautious about. If all you hear is 4%, you might not realize this number is based on a weak data point of just 5 persons. By contrast, including or excluding a single person randomly from the 39 counted among Christians has very little effect on the result, and thus we have a more robust frequency there. For example, 40 out of 890, which is 4.5%, is pretty close to the 4.4%. The tables are useful because it cuts through the misleading or deceptive way percentages can be used to get you right back to the actual data, the actual things being counted, and what these counts were. You can then start to see what the percentages presented to you are actually percentages of, what is actually being compared or measured, and whether they might be dodgy or weak. And yes, this is a lot of math, but almost all lies and misinformation and errors we face today and have to critically think through are mathematical now. So this is definitely a skill we need to bone up on to arm ourselves against people who will use our avoidance of math against us, or who need to be able to catch the mistakes they are making, which we can only do with at least this much grasp of the math. Some requires much more advanced skill than average folk can muster. Our intellectual self-defense requires it. It's one of the essential katas of this martial art. So one of the challenge questions was to go to Wikipedia, the list of cognitive biases, and pick one of them at random. So I'm supposed to name and describe the listed item you have selected, and after learning more about it, which you can do either by using additional linked Wikipedia page or using Google, propose at least one way you might get caught in this bias, then propose at least one technique for how you might avoid falling victim to this bias. So I skimmed down and I chose one that I think a bias that I currently have myself. Gender bias. A widely held set of implicit biases that discriminates against gender. For example, the assumption that women are less suited to jobs requiring high intellectual ability, or the assumption that people or animals are male in the absence of any indicators of gender. And I listed my assertions. 1. Cultural, societal, and subjectively imposed gender roles play a role in determining the future career paths of young people. However, number 2, genetic, sex-based differences play a much bigger role, and I cite this study. Number 3, sex-linked interest preferences are not mere artifacts of socialization. Number 4, nature, not nurture, significantly accounts for the type of career paths young people tend to gravitate towards. Number 5, this can be a factor in accounting for the gender pay disparity. Number 6, if my assertions are wrong, then I am most likely committing a gender bias. In my estimation, the techniques to determine whether or not I have indeed fallen victim to a cognitive bias of this nature would be: 1. Increase my amount of research on the subject. 2. Look for publicly available criticism of my position by experts in the field, and to avoid reading only those data which support my claim. And finally, number 3, to vary the sources I look at, i.e. the types of publications, geographical variation, credentials of those who conducted the research, etc. And this is Dr. Carrier's response. This is based on the study that I cited. How does a 9-month-old know what a pot is, and why would it be associated with either gender? Are women typically metalsmiths? Aren't heavy metal objects more obviously weapons? Aren't most chefs boys? Aren't tools like pots a boy thing? How does a 9 month old know what a digging machine is? And could they have evolved genes for using diggers or driving cars? Was it ancient aliens? Doesn't mom do most of the driving in the family? Aren't wheeled tools, say like a wheeled cart for pushing toddlers around in, a mom thing? How would they get the idea that cars are for boys? It can't be in their genes, right? Asking questions like these will really zero in on how to critically think these things through. This is garbage science. They didn't even control for what toys their parents bought these kids and thus were already familiar to them before placed in the study. That boys and girls would play with toys resembling the ones their parents brought them is kind of a no-brainer. So for a study to not even control for that variable literally kills it as useless. Never trust small study science. Most of it is false, especially in psychology, even more so in evolutionary psychology. We found 2 out of every 3 studies fails to even be replicable, and even more have such a bad design they aren't even logically capable of producing the conclusions they are after. Such as a study that does not control for parental influence, claiming it had found effects that were independent of parental influence. So you have to actually read and critically assess any such studies on their merits. And then I'm linked to an article, is 90% of all Evo Psych false? This 2016 study is the same garbage. Many red flags are in there. For example, they cite the monkey studies as precedent, which are even more absurd and are covered in my Evo Psych article. Monkeys have no human interest that can be gendered, much less as would correlate with what would be to monkeys completely unintelligible technologies, much less genetically salient ones like POTS or activities involving fine manipulation, which is weirdly typed as masculine, even though sewing is a far more fine manipulation skill than playing with a car or a toy digger. Yet at the same time, they actually admit a meta analysis of studies examining parents' differential socialization of boys and girls found evidence of a parental encouragement of children's sex typed activities. So the contrary hypothesis is multiply replicated. I suspect their peer reviewers forced them to admit this and cite it. They dismissed that multiply replicated result with a possibilitor fallacy. The authors caution that such encouragement may be, and conflate parents being in the room as the only way such influences occur, with how actual parental influence works. For example, how they have already decorated a nursery before birth and started talking to and playing with their baby, and their baby starts imitating and emulating to please their parents almost immediately after birth, which influences begin molding them from then on, not requiring continued parental presence for that influence to be exhibited. So just testing kids alone cannot remove the control condition of the parental influence. This kind of bad logic should never pass peer review. Science has a problem, especially Evo Psych. Its standards are the worst. Ironically, they chose toys gender based on the gendered assumptions of the adults raising kids in the same population group, and they didn't get the obvious clue whose assumption those kids might be imitating. This is an example of why cross-cultural studies are so important. Do kids act in the same way in all periods and all cultures? The answer is no. For example, dolls used to be a boy thing. Machines such as sewing machines, washing machines, churning machines used to be a girl thing. If you compare the rest of the study to all the stuff in the Hines studies I call out in my Evo Psych article, you'll see why this is the same junk science. And regarding my note that nature, not nurture, significantly accounts for the type of career paths that young people tend to gravitate towards, Richard noted that the only evidence you have cited is toy studies, which do not connect with career path choices as adults. Hardly any girls who play with pots become metalsmiths or chefs. Hardly any boys who play with balls pursue any career involving a ball. So you haven't cited any evidence pertaining to premise 4. And responding to the 3 techniques I would use to determine if I had fallen victim to a gender bias, Richard says that's all true and useful in every subject. One should always test all of one's beliefs against the best evidence against it and critically burn test the logic its best advocates used for it. But there is a more direct procedure that would be helpful to start with. Check what evidence is being cited. You cited 2 articles, both of which contain the same evidence, toy studies. Check if that evidence relates to the question, do toddlers' toys have anything to do with their later adult careers? Has anyone shown any such correlation? And lastly, check if that evidence is even credible. Sample sizes under 10, effects that increase with age and can't even have been genetically evolved in the first place, like knowing what pots or wheeled objects or who uses them. Following that procedure, which you could have done with your own 2-sided articles, read and critically test the one study, and from the other, trace and read the one study they cite in turn. It would have led you to some serious doubts, and the fact that you didn't already question these studies or check their merits critically before trusting them is perhaps the strongest evidence for a gender bias. It steered you away from critical thinking and made you a ready dupe of selection bias, rather than protecting yourself against bad arguments and even worse science. When I discovered this, it alarmed me, and now I'm no one's dupe ever again. If there is a single lesson most important to learn, it is that biases make you easy to dupe. Critical thinking as a way of life, giving no quarter, every view gets the same test, is the cure. The only armor that stops that bullet. The only thing to avoid is the slipping out of the Aristotelian mean. Aristotle held that every virtue lies at the mean between the 2 extremes. Too much generosity and you will become easily exploitable. Too little and you are callous. Critical thinking lies between gullibility and the opposite extreme, being too skeptical of everything, having no achievable standard for when to admit the evidence is good enough for a conclusion to be likely. Climate science deniers and anti-vaxxers and flat earthers are too skeptical and thus impervious to evidence when it comes to things they don't want to believe, and too gullible when it comes to things they do want to believe in, and thus buy all manner of nonsense uncritically, hook, line, and sinker. So the goal is to be neither of those things, and certainly to align neither to a bias and to be alarmed when you catch yourself doing that, but treat everything equally. Next challenge question was to choose one point made in the reading assignments that was the most difficult for me to grasp or understand. So I chose Levitin's Field Guide to Lies, page 199. You'll see a rough example of the chart here that was in the book. So I write, let me make sure I understand this. The number of times I thought about someone in a week and they called right afterwards is 2 out of the total number of phone calls. The number of times I thought about someone in a week and they didn't call is 50. So automatically I have a problem with that. Like, is that an arbitrary number, 50? If they didn't call, how can you count the number of not calls? The next one is the number of times someone called, but I wasn't thinking about them. That's 18. That can be objectively measured. So I thought about someone, they didn't call. That was 18. The last one is the number of times no one called and I wasn't thinking about them. So this has to be an arbitrary number too, 930. So how many possible times could I have thought about someone but didn't? And anyway, you can see where I had some problems. So my questions were, 1, why fill out this entire chart if we only need the first column? 2, the book tries to walk me through running through all these numbers, but it's really too confusing, as you saw. 3, once I learn how to run all the numbers, what additional probabilities would I be able to get? How would I be able to word these? And Dr. Carrier answers, he directs me to the point in the book that tries to explain it. 2 out of 20 calls were from long lost friends who you hadn't thought about for a while, but they called within 10 minutes of you thinking of them. That's the top row of your table, 20 calls. 2 that you summoned miraculously, 18 that you didn't. But wait, we have to fill in the bottom row of the table. How many times were you thinking about people and they didn't call? And here's my favorite, how many times were you not thinking about someone and they didn't call? All 4 numbers matter. All 4 show that there are actually 1,000 events we are looking at, and we are only choosing 2 to call remarkable. But that 2 remarkable things would happen in a collection of 1,000 events is not that odd. Likewise, we think 2 in 50 times is remarkable from column 1, even though that means most people we were thinking of don't then call. But then we don't notice how often people call when we aren't thinking about them, which is more often, 2 to 18. So only 2 out of 20, which equals only 10% of the time, does someone I am thinking of actually call, relative to all the people who do call. Because we don't register that as remarkable. We are thus biased to over-notice coincidences and under-notice all the times coincidences don't occur. This includes how often am I thinking about old friends and they don't call, and how often does neither happen. This is one of the key problems with humans' innate incompetence to process probability, which causes most false beliefs, from superstitions and religion to conspiracy thinking and other secular false beliefs. And then Richard points me towards another optional reading assignment, everything you need to know about coincidences. Okay, this next challenge question I found particularly interesting. The challenge is, below are 4 informal syllogisms that are incomplete. These are called enthymemes. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Being that they are missing a premise, which missing premise is often a system 1 assumption. For each one, A, identify the missing premise that would make the conclusion true in deductive logic, and B, describe the best evidence you can find against that missing premise being true. All right, there's 4 of them. The first one is, the Quran commands the murder of apostates, and then a missing premise, and then conclusion, therefore, Islam as an ideology commands the murder of apostates. As the premise, I put in, the Quran is the foundational prescriptive text for the religion of Islam. And I made a note that evidence that would make the missing premise false if it turned out the Quran had no such commands. And I admitted that I couldn't honestly remember off the top of my head, but I do know the Hadith contains multiple commands to kill apostates, and to be a Muslim, you must follow the Quran and the Hadiths. Dr. Carrier's reply, strictly speaking, that would be a form of non sequitur, as you would need a third premise otherwise, like a religious ideology always corresponds exactly with what is in its prescriptive texts, which is, of course, fairly universally false. For example, there is hardly a Christian alive who actually follows the Sermon on the Mount, and almost no sects actually match anything in it, even in their officially preached morality and policy. For example, find a sect whose official position is to refuse to engage in or endorse any violence whatsoever, even in self-defense, nor even to resist thieves or enslavers. You could just skip the third premise method and just restate the missing premise as, for example, the Quran commands the murder of apostates. Islam, as an ideology, corresponds exactly with what the Quran commands. Therefore, Islam, as an ideology, commands the murder of apostates. Carrier notes here that his method of using brackets to block out the variables and not deviating the wording at any point in them, so you can be sure to complete a valid syllogism, as you may find that a useful tool. To be valid, the conclusion can contain no material not in the premises, and must contain all the material in the premises, either literally or by implication. Then you can subject this to a force perspective test. The Bible commands the murder of apostates. Christianity as an ideology corresponds exactly with what the Bible commands. Therefore, Christianity as an ideology commands the murder of apostates. Premise 1 is true for the Bible. It actually isn't for the Quran. No such command is in there. It may be in the Hadith, but the Hadith isn't the Quran. And indeed, different Islamic sects disagree on which hadiths are authoritative or even authoritative at all. And the trend in modernizing Islamic movements is to disregard the hadith as unreliable or no longer authoritative. So the hadith to Muslims is more like the Talmud to Jews, the words of men, not the voice of God spoken through the angel Gabriel, leading to disagreement over how inspired those men's words were, or which ones were, or whether they even apply anymore, and even whether Muslims in the first world no claim to respect them is of questionable use as a statistic, just as asking a first world Jew whether they respect what is in the Talmud. In practice, they don't, but that's because they don't even know what's in it. They just revere it because they were told they should. In reality, almost no Jews today follow anything in the Talmud and would never endorse it if they ever actually bothered to look at what was in there. Second example, the Bible commands the murder of apostates. Therefore, Judaism as an ideology commands the murder of apostates. So for the premise I put in, the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, is the foundational prescriptive text for the religion of Judaism. And I listed as any evidence that would make this premise false if Judaism has reformed to a point where the Bible is no longer used as a literal, authoritative source for morality. Dr. Carrier writes, this is the same mistake with respect to validity. Your premise 2 doesn't work to get the conclusion to be valid, but you could fix that in exactly the same way I explained in the first example. But now you need to correct the final answer. You correctly outline the evidence that would be needed to make premise 2 false. Notice how you didn't do that for the previous parallel example. You might want to be curious why. There, for some reason, you seem focused on premise 1, what the Quran actually commands, when the question was to look at what would falsify the required premise 2. The answer would have been the same. If Islam has reformed to the point where the Quran is no longer used as a literal authoritative source for morality, although to make the parallel correct, we need to mean the same thing. Obviously, Jews, both liberal Reform and conservative Orthodox Jews, believe the Bible is the authoritative source for morality, yet hardly any actually believe or preach that its commandment to murder apostates is to be followed. So they clearly mean something else by authoritative source for morality when speaking of the Bible. Their ideology seems largely divorced from what's in the Bible, really. So the question is, how often is that true for Muslims? Devout Muslim women in Turkey drink and wear their hair out, yet also will say the Quran is the authoritative source for morality. They are doing the same thing Jews do. So which sects do we mean? Muslims in which countries? On which side of the political divide there? The ones killing other Muslims for being too modern, or the Muslims they are killing for being too modern? What really is the difference between Muslims, Jews, and Christians? Their ideologies do not seem much anchored to the revered scriptures, yet revere them despite all their scriptures being horrific and barbaric, and they all have violent conservative and backwards factions and peaceful liberal and progressive factions. All three generate terrorist movements even still today. The third argument. Islam as an ideology commands the killing of infidels. Therefore, Muslims kill infidels. I put in the premise, some Muslims follow the teachings of Islam to the letter. And I cite evidence that would make this premise false if the occurrence of violent Islamic retaliation against apostates dropped to 0. And Dr. Carrier completely annihilates this one as well, if you didn't already guess. He writes, "Note, you did not construct a valid syllogism again. I'll use blocks again to show what I mean. Remember the rule. The conclusion must contain everything in the premises and contain nothing but what is in the premises." And as you can see in his response, that I think the main thing is I forgot to include the word some in the conclusion, which in my defense, it's implied, but he's right. Everything needs to be included. And so to make it tighter or clearer, he adds some. And he continues, the more trivial point, the wording you chose more or less means the same thing, but it is unclear if that's so, or if that wording ends up represented in the conclusion validly, and so on. To avoid that, stick to the same wording in the premises that get blocked into the conclusion. The more substantive point, the qualifier some must commute to the conclusion. Otherwise, you get a false or ambiguous conclusion. For example, what does Muslims kill mean? There are Muslims who kill, or all Muslims kill. Just retain the word in the premise in the conclusion to avoid this, some Muslims. Again, of course, premise one also happens to be false as Christianity and Judaism as ideologies command the killing of infidels. There are some versions of each that do, but some is not all. And statistically, most Muslims adhere to no ideology that does, particularly in democracies. But even in tyrannies, for example, Iran, most Muslims have no actual interest in the fascist teachings of their state, but are in fact being oppressed by it. But that wasn't the point of this exercise, but to find the hidden premise that would get from one to the conclusion. And throughout this section of study, we had some disagreement over whether the Quran commands the killing of infidels. So I cite Surah 3, verse 151, Surah 2, verse 191, and Surah 9, verse 5, and some others, but we'll stick to those three. And Dr. Carey replies, actually, none of those verses command the killing of infidels. Surah 9:5 might seem to when taken out of context, but in context, it refers to pagans who broke a peace treaty. It is thus a self-defense commandment. For example, the earlier verse 9:4 says the opposite. Treaties not dissolved with those pagans with whom ye have entered into alliance and have not subsequently failed you in aught, nor aided anyone against you. So fulfill your engagements with them to the end of their term, for Allah loveth the righteous. It is in fact a reference to a specific historical treaty, not a general rule. It would not even apply to any modern situation. Hence, it refers to a specific 4-month ceasefire with certain tribes in Arabia at the time of Muhammad. That I did not know. And how many times have I cited that? It's kind of embarrassing, actually.